Occasionally, the birds sing to remind us of another time, a time when poetry wasn't about twittering, but a time when the poem was on the page so that it could exist between people. Occasionally, one looks over their shoulder into the quiet recesses of the past to discover flocks of ulipo birds singing in the trees. Everyone look over their shoulders. Carefully look over your shoulders. Ulipo, ulipo. And look through the mist that makes up everyone's imagination suddenly. There are notions through which we must all look for the words that blast like sunshine, words like mountainous, or watercolor, or portraiture, warble and coo. And there in the midst of all that cacophony is the figure of someone. Can you just make it out? No, you can't. All you know for certain is that it is most definitely not James Joyce. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our occasional troubadour, Victor Coleman.
Let's hear it for the hunch. When I was 12, I played in a band called Terry and the Pirates. What you're seeing are images that illustrate this book. They're portraits. Poems are all portraits. Poems are all portraits of friends, acquaintances. I took out the enemies. Culture heroes, just folk. And when I spoke to David Bolduc, the drawer of these, he's an abstract painter. So when he showed me these, I said, well, these would look good beside my abstract portraits of people. And sure enough, they did. And we went through many configurations. But then he passed in April, and we had to go back to square one, which is what you're seeing. That's Tacky's cat. I'm going to start with a poem for a very old friend of mine that I used to work with just down the street here at the drop-in center. His name is Martin Clemente. The power and pride of riches was vastly tempered by public responsibility, unapplied only as their value disappeared. In time, the world discovered that the race must die. As we descended together toward the wild valley, as your eye follows up the quaint old fronts of a narrow street, you will probably find yourself in the promenade. But there is yet another and still better point of view. And so, particularly in cities, the lowest of the dignities, the vertical crag, is in the angle between the two mountains and rivers. As a flight of stairs, twisting here, turning abruptly there, for he had more than they to do and more than they to risk. And we have still to learn two fundamental ideas. Titles are now an anachronism. And the anachronism is rapidly proving fatal. A few miles farther on, but still among the spurs, the situation seemed rather significant. And the dialogue was very difficult. I'm going to read the poem that started me on this incredible journey. It's for a very old friend of mine, David Alinsky, I don't think is here. And I was thinking, what am I going to do next? So I found it. My wife Kate found this text called "The Troubadours at Home," which was published in 1898. And being fascinated by the troubadours, being good friends with one of the best translators of the troubadours, Paul Blackburn, I thought, oh, maybe I'll do something like that. And then, of course, John Cage intervened and said, but they have to be mesostics. And mesostics, if you don't know what they are, look sort of like this. I don't know whether you can see it from there. There's no slides, but what it is basically is the name of the person of whom this is a portrait appears down the middle of the text. I'll get to David Bullock in a minute. This is David Holinsky. So I presented this to him. It was his 60th birthday. I put it in a frame. I said, David, this is a portrait. He's a photographer, right? So he does portraits all the time. And he came up to me about 3 hours into the birthday party and said, you have to come into my living room and read this poem because this is the closest anybody has ever got in writing to who I am. I'm not kidding. The guard will see you to your hand baggage, and the trunks will take care of themselves. Old men and maidens, young men and women, inquire of the driver how soon his vehicle will set out. But we had no intention of backsliding and found ourselves quite unable to guess. Wide, smooth, and hard, shaded without intermission, stretching out its length some 50 feet. How different a city they found. The merchants of the Levant thronged its bazaars, and a castle still echoing with the songs of a famous troubadour. Queer windows of all sizes seemed to be keeping dark secrets. Fierce, with an intensity and fixedness of gaze. So the portraits that David did had nothing to do with my poetry. Absolutely nothing. Except, at some point, they sort of got together. So I'm not going to be looking at these, so I can't tell you. But at some point, there will be a portrait of the great American poet Robert Creeley, who died a few years ago, who was a really good friend of mine. And so there's actually a portrait of Robert Creeley in David's oeuvre, and this is a poem called Robert Creeley. His will was never thwarted and his courage never daunted, while his sad misfortune left but little will to sing. It was only a game and for ignoble stakes. Love was a passion in his eye that had long seemed a childish affair, which maintained imposing courts and entertained magnificence, and made rich presents to deserving poets. For love had the dignity of the old school and the essence of it. We may believe his life pursued 100 other flames. The taste both for arms and for poetry continued in his children. Music and poetry were no less welcome there. The gem doesn't shine, a blow he couldn't hear, blind eye, dumb tongue, the loud song of rivers coming up as slumberous murmurs from a time that played no insignificant part in public affairs. At this point, I'll take requests. I just heard one. Happily, my sister is visiting. The occasion isn't terribly happy, but the fact that she's here is fabulous. From Roberts Creek, British Columbia, where I lived for a while myself. It's a fabulous place. This is for Alice Coleman. Her taste for poetry, even more than her wit and good nature, were nearly covered with the finest work. An exquisite rug, only simpler, as the work of an earlier day would be. Lizards crawled up the bowl of the lamp, held the chains in their mouths, but very few observers were cool enough to analyze her. When she spoke, her voice was peculiarly pleasant. The figure of the Savior was inlaid in ivory upon the crucifix. Plaques of enamel decorated with various patterns and colors were set. Their intense love of praise, their passionate burning for distinction, the appearance of embroidered flowers was 50 years too early. The shape of it and its features were far from displeasing, as were the 2 roses that adorned them. I have 9 grandchildren, folks, so don't worry about the kids.